Hello, and welcome to a new educational and insightful presentation from Baselode Energy, highlighting the many features and exploration target opportunities that exist on our shadow property. I'm James Sykes, CEO and President of Baselode. I'll be your narrator for the next hour or so. This talk is part one of a two-part series. I get asked quite frequently, why do you love shadow, and what do you see there? Well, I'll take this opportunity to personally show you. You're now being invited into my brain. I really hope that you enjoy this and learn something of interest, not just about the shadow property, but also about geology in general, to help you understand some of the technical aspects when geologists talk their talk. For those of you who know me personally, you know that I'll try to educate as much as possible. And I think I've done an excellent job of really simplifying everything for you, the non-geologist, to understand. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. I must point out the disclaimer for forward-looking statements and other things that I might say. The views expressed in this presentation are my own and do not represent the geology or structural geology community. As always, I recommend that you do your own due diligence. And now on with the show. I'm basically going to cover faults and structures in a general overview. Why do we need them? Why do we look for them? I'll show you some examples and ideas and describe some of the terminology. We'll also look at faults and features in the Athabasca deposits themselves as analogs, and then we'll review the shadow structural setting everything up for an interpretation of the MT results that we flew back in August, September of this year. So we'll be looking at plans and cross-section views, and also looking at target areas with uranium potential. So why do we need to know about faults and structures? What importance do they have? Simply put, we need to move fluids through hard rocks. You're all familiar with rocks. You know they're hard. Fluids won't pass through them. Now, if you look at the example below the red line, you can't move fluids through hard rocks. It's not until you fracture the rocks, as is in the case between the red lines, that you can start to move fluids through these hard rocks. Fractures create porosity, which in the orange definition are voids and empty spaces within the rocks, which in turn significantly increases the permeability, which is the green definition, the capacity of the rock to transport those fluids. Fractures and structures basically open up a geological plumbing system and let the fluids pour in, geologically speaking. So this is why we're looking at faults and fractures. We need to move fluids through hard rocks, very simplistic. So I want to take you down to the city of San Francisco in the Golden State of California, USA, because there's something important that happens there that will help you understand the terminology of faults and fractures. Earthquakes. Everybody knows what an earthquake is. Kids in kindergarten know what earthquakes are. This is a simple geological concept to help you understand how faults and structures actually form. When you hear geologists talk about faults and structures, think of an earthquake. The San Andreas Fault, probably the most famous fault in North America. There have even been movies dedicated to them. I haven't watched them myself, and I don't plan to. The San Andreas itself is variable in size when exposed at surface. If you look at the middle picture, it shows a fault width probably 30 centimeters thick or less, whereas the picture on the right, it's either meters to tens of meters thick. So the San Andreas Fault and earthquakes are intimately connected. Faulting along the San Andreas produces earthquakes. Now, faults typically occur when two rock masses move against each other, sometimes up or down, sometimes left or right. Most of the times, it's a combination of these movements. The focus of an earthquake, shown here as the yellow stars, is the trigger point, where a fault has originally moved. It's the largest movement along the fault, and it's what causes earthquakes. Rock masses literally snap, and that energy is released in waves through the rocks, causing earthquakes. Something important to note though, most earthquake foci occur between 10 to 30 kilometers depth on average. They can occur shallower or deeper, but most of them are within that 10 to 30 kilometer range from surface. So when you think of movement along a fault, you have to realize that this is not something that is smooth or continuous. It's very sporadic and jerky with periods of very quick activity, on the scale of minutes to weeks, even months. But the times when a fault is not moving is even longer. These are periods of quiescence over tens to hundreds of years. But these are the periods where the fault is building up and building up under stress to snap and let loose with earthquakes. Consider the movement along the San Andreas Fault over the past 150 years, as indicated by the earthquake foci. In 1857, down in the south here. Then in 1906, San Francisco area, which was very destructive. 1957 was west of San Francisco. 1989, the year my Oakland Athletics won the World Series. And in 2004, we're back down to where we started in 1857. So the distance between the earthquake foci from 2004 to 1989 is 250 kilometers long, or 150 miles. That's a long distance of no earthquake foci. That is an area that is more than likely building up for a big fault. The point with this slide is that it takes a very long time to develop a lengthy fault zone or structure, and that the fault will rupture along different segments over different periods of times, and will even rupture in the same places more frequently than others. The San Andreas is approximately 1,300 kilometers long, or 800 miles, and it's been active for 30 million years. Another way to look at that is it takes 23 years to move 1 meter at surface. That's 3 feet. It's a very slow process. This is a topic that I will revisit in the second part of this series because the periods of quiescence and short activity are necessary for fluid mixtures during the formation of Athabasca uranium deposits. Now we'll build on the knowledge and details we've already established thus far. Although the San Andreas is a long fault, it's also part of an extensive fault network. So it's not just the San Andreas moving on its own. There are other faults in the area that are also moving. More faults, more foci. From an exploration point of view, where I'd be looking to find mineral deposits are within the red circles. Notice the locations that interest me are all points of divergence or convergence, or what I will simply refer to here on as bifurcating or branching. Where two faults intersect, you're sure to get more damage zones, more fractures and structures, therefore more earthquakes. And we know what fractures and structures do for permeability and porosity in rocks, right? They allow fluids to flow. That's what we're looking for. I'm not sure if you can see the colors on the lines clearly, but the hotter the color, up to white, the higher the probability of an earthquake. And if you take a good look at that, the higher probabilities are these bifurcation points. Coincidence? No idea. The San Francisco earthquake of 1906 occurred on the San Andreas Fault, right at one of these bifurcation points. If you recall the 1957 earthquake on the previous map, it was west of San Francisco. Well, there's your reason. The smaller and weaker San Gregorio Fault connects with the San Andreas in this area. Bifurcation points lead to increased structural activity. However, when you look at the reality of the situation, the fault landscape is far more complex as the faults aren't necessarily one easily traceable line. They are a series of anastomosing and subparallel structures. But this is what we want, not to live in, mind you, but from an exploration point of view, we want to see a lot of structures and faults. The more we see, the higher potential for fluid migration. And with this detailed landscape, I can see far more areas that I think would make excellent fluid or commodity traps. So, what are we looking for? We're actually looking for ancient earthquakes. If we're exploring for earthquakes, then we really want to find the focus points of these earthquakes because they would have been the areas that dilated and moved the most compared with the rest of the fault. Welcome to the detailed world of structures. In this example, there are over 20 different styles of dilation zones associated with strike-slip faults. Now, each of these examples would represent the type of features that we are looking for. These are earthquake fault focus points. Have a good look at the examples, and you'll notice a repeating pattern, simplifying what we are looking for. The lozenge or sigmoid. I'll probably just simply refer to it as lozenges from here on in. The lozenge is a repeating shape in almost all of those structural examples. So we don't need to necessarily know the complete fault kinematics to make a discovery. We just have to look for that shape. Once found, we can use the drill hole data to figure out the kinematics, which would make exploration more efficient thereafter. So the image on the left is a plan map looking obliquely at the surface. But these same features can readily exist in the vertical space too. Sometimes they are known as flower structures. A variety of flower structures also exist, as you can see here on the image on the right. But when I look at these, I see a lot of potential for fluid migration along these fault structures. But the reality is that there will be more numerous structures between each of the fault portions. So basically, by adding all of those little faults, we've just doubled the porosity of this flower structure, and that's exactly what we need. In some of the upcoming examples on shadow, you'll see how the tail ends of a lot of the interpreted faults will shift or flip sides. This geological phenomenon can be explained by a number of possibilities, and a few of them are shown here just for clarity purposes. The top left-hand image is a flower structure that we saw in the previous slide, but in a three-dimensional model. If you now add a pivot point, the middle model, to these blocks, then you'll create a scissor fault, which is the lower example. Alternatively, fault ramps, which is the case on the right, can also produce the same interpreted tail end flips. In this case, you can see the damage zone between the two thick fault zones, which are colored in black. We use these to figure out where we'll find deposits. One last concept before we move on to some Athabasca and shadow examples. Foliation. Foliation is a repetitive planar layering in metamorphic rocks. We typically call foliated rocks gneiss, schist, or myelinites. Some of you may have heard these terms before, but have you actually understood them? Well, the definition is there for you, and I use foliation as my main guide for determining the most likely fault and structural orientation. Why? Because the foliations that we'll see are probably caused by regional shear force. By acquiring and interpreting foliation measurements, they can also lead us to deposits. Let's look at some of the Athabasca analogs now that you're all certified structural geologists. This image is a plan map of Cameco's Rabbit Lake basement-hosted deposit. It's from 1978, so it's still old, but it serves the purpose. Similar to foliation, we can use the differentiating rock layers to find out how the structural system and corridors we are interested in. Do you see anything of interest here? How about now? The red lines over the geology define a lozenge. I just haven't attached lines to each other, but I'm sure you can see the shape. And how about this one? Same thing with the blue lines, just following the lithological contacts, we can make out a lozenge. Lo and behold, the Rabbit Lake deposit is here in the green circle. Rabbit Lake was formed in an area with lithological lozenges. The mineralized structures followed the upper lithological contact along the blue line, which is a fault zone. Now we'll jump over to Cameco's Eagle Point deposits. Unlike the Rabbit Lake example, these are cross sections, so now we're looking at the vertical orientation of the geology. These blue lines map out the Collins Bay Fault on both sections. The Collins Bay Fault is adjacent to Archean granitoids on the left-hand side of the fault, which are hard and competent rocks, whereas the rocks on the right-hand side of the fault where all of the structures, alteration, and mineralization occur are geologically softer and more amenable to flowing with the regional forces that create our foliation. Therefore, they will accommodate faults more readily than the granitoids do. On the north deposit, which is the left side image, I've highlighted the structural and alteration corridor with the red lines. This envelope hosts the uranium mineralization, which are the black polygons. Coincidentally enough, where the mineralization is strongest, we see the red lines blow out and widen. You can even call it a lozenge. Even within the mineralization itself, you can see multiple small-scale lozenges. Fractals, my old friend, self-repeating patterns at different scales. Never cease to let me down. Hopping over to the south deposit, which is the right side image, I've done the same thing with the alteration and structural envelope. Can't really see a lozenge in this, but what you can see is something similar to what I showed earlier when discussing the San Andreas Fault and showing the detailed fault landscape. In this situation, we've got numerous subparallel faults. Well, basically, all of these create porosity and permeability. It's a wonderful structural regime. But if you're looking at the mineralization, you can see plenty of lozenge shapes within there. Are those our earthquake foci? I wonder. This last structure, alteration, mineralization envelope that I want to point out, I want you to keep in mind as investors that should we, Baselode, come across such small zones of mineralization in our maiden drill maiden drill program at Shadow, there might very well be a larger structural network with far more mineralization right in the area, either a long strike, down dip, or simply subparallel to this whole system. Any little snip that we can find could end up being quite meaningful. All right, now we're going to head over to Cameco and Orano's Key Lake deposit. This is one of my favorite Athabasca deposits. A lot of people know my thoughts on it. But right now, we're just going to look at the structure of it, and we're looking at a cross-section view through the Gaertner deposit, which is now here highlighted in the red oval. If you look at the foliations on the left-hand side of the image, which is the blue line, they're all shallow dipping foliations. When we jump over to the right-hand side of the image with another blue line, this shows a moderately dipping foliation, so we're already seeing a slight change in foliations. But right there in the middle, below the deposit, marked by the red line, is steeply dipping foliation. So the change in orientation of the foliation is responsible for emplacement of the ore zone. To a degree, there are more factors involved, just not going to get into them right now. Also note the thicker and more prevalent graphitic horizons occur here too. These are the primary structures. But how can we explain the change in foliations? Maybe with this guy, our friend the lozenge. Maybe Key Lake occurs on any one of these areas of the lozenge highlighted with a black circle. I'm not saying that's definitely it, just offering one simple suggestion. Regardless of the lozenge or not, the slight change in foliation has shown to be quite meaningful. How meaningful? Well, let's continue. Denison's Gryphon deposit, one of the most recent Athabasca basement discoveries. Looks like a great system. I really like it. I'd love to find something similar like that on Shadow. In this image, we're looking at a plan map view of the Gryphon area. Now let's look at these sterionets, all of these white circles on there. A sterionet is a tool geologists use to map, analyze, and interpret structures. I'm not going to teach you how to read them, simply show you that they can be used to identify subtle changes in foliation measurements. In this case, the two black arrows are pointing to foliation measurements north and south of Gryphon. The sterionets show that the foliation orientations are roughly the same. But when you look at the foliation measurements at Gryphon, which is indicated by the red arrow, they show a subtle variation, a very slight change. This slight change is enough to produce the porosity and permeability to accommodate a uranium deposit. And if you look at Denison's structural interpretation of Gryphon, bang, there it is, the lozenge, our earthquake focus. So staying with Gryphon, but now we're looking at a cross-sectional view. Their lithological interpretations show no variation at all. So that's similar to the sterionets that we saw on the surface, which was on the previous slide, that they're all the same. But when you look at the deposit, you can see very subtle undulations, similar to the changes observed in the sterionets. We can even interpret a couple of lozenges here based on the geology. But don't take my word for it. Look at Denison's interpretation. They have the lozenge. Now moving on to something that's really dear to my heart, something that I am very familiar with, NextGen's Arrow deposit. We're going to be looking at sterionets again, so put your structural hats on. We're going to see how foliation measurements clearly highlights Arrow from the rest of the trend it's on. Arrow is located here with the big red star. If you look at the sterionets associated with all of the yellow stars pointed to with black arrows, they're all roughly the same orientation. That trend that we're looking at is a few kilometers long, and there's no real variation along it, except for at Arrow itself. The foliations at Arrow are much different than the rest. They're steeper, they're basically vertical, whereas the rest of the corridor are all dipping to the southeast. Remember this tiny little flexure along a corridor. It could be quite meaningful. So this slide here was taken from a presentation I gave at the Saskatchewan Geological Open House in 2014. We're still looking at NextGen's Arrow. It clearly highlights exactly what we were targeting back then. The first hole into the system, we discovered the deposit. We hit 4 different zones. What I want to highlight though is the break in the conductors. You see those gray lines with the circles on them that look like a beaded necklace? Those are the conductors. And notice how they diverge from each other. If there was nothing in this area, no deposit, no major structure, then we would imagine the conductor to be a straight line through here, like this. It would be similar to the stereo nets that you saw in the previous example, everything dipping to the southeast. But it's not. The conductors clearly bend from each other, right along that gravity low bullseye as well. Good old gravity, such a wonderful tool. Diverging conductors with a gravity bullseye. It was the ultimate target. And I'm really hoping that we see something like that on Shadow, especially when we get that gravity done. But digressing with dreams of grandeur, the point I want to make is that you can use the diverging conductors and gravity bullseye to interpret this guy, the lozenge. It's there. So we've looked at enough other deposits. Let's move on towards Shadow. Still a few more things to educate you on though with. So on this image, Shadow is right down here on the yellow star. Shadow is staked along the Virgin River shear zone, which is this red line. If we're looking for structure, I'm pretty sure we found it. The current length of the Virgin River shear zone is twice as much as the San Andreas Fault. The Virgin River shear zone is 2,800 kilometers long. It's like driving from Toronto to Saskatoon or New York to Denver. I thought the San Andreas looked pretty good from a structural point of view, but the Virgin River shear zone is much better. We're looking for structures that have been long-lived, remobilized over time and time again. Well, guess what? The Virgin River shear zone is certainly one of those structures. All right, I'm sorry, but I have to go back to Arrow only momentarily. I saw this presentation on Arrow in January of this year, 2020, before I joined Baselode, before we had ever thought of looking at the Virgin River shear zone. But there it is. NextGen compared their tectonic setting or full geometry to outcrops at Turner Lake, approximately 130 kilometers southeast of Arrow. So what? Who cares about this area? I'm glad I caught this in this presentation, because here's the outcrop location at Turner Lake from the previous slide, indicated here at the red star. It's on the Virgin River shear zone, within 5 kilometers of Shadow. So basically, NextGen has just compared the Arrow corridor to the Virgin River shear zone. How good is that? We've got one of the most successful uranium juniors in the Athabasca Basin comparing their structural setting for their Arrow deposit to what we have on the Shadow property within the Virgin River shear zone. That's beautiful. That completely reaffirms my confidence that we're looking in the right area to make a uranium deposit discovery on Shadow. This has sealed the deal. Not actually. I do lie. It does get a lot better than this, I promise. So what kind of structures were we seeing at Arrow? We had the earliest evidence of major structures in the area, which are all mylanites, highlighted there in that red box. Mylanites form under plastic conditions, so when it's hot enough and the pressure's strong enough that the rocks will flow with plastic-like deformation. So they flow, just remember that. However, those myelinite structures were reused during brittle conditions, creating cataclasites, breccias, and gouges, the brittle structures, which are all highlighted in the blue box. So when the temperature is lower and the pressure is less, then similar to plastic that we see today, you can break plastic after it has molded and solidified. Those are your cataclasite type of rocks. They're the same structures, the cataclasites are the same structures being reactivated as the mylanites, but they're under different temperature and pressure conditions. But it's those brittle structures that host all of the uranium. The point is, mylanites can be reactivated during brittle conditions and draw in uraniferous fluids. So we'll have a quick look at where we are with relation to plastic and brittle regimes, which are denoted by the thick blue line. Plastic is at the depth, which is where you get your mylanites. Brittle's on top, which is where you get your cataclasites. During a mountain building event, as thus, we will form mylanites at depth. Saskatchewan used to be part of the largest mountain belt in history. You wouldn't believe it living in this province now, but it's true. So we want to look deep. We want to investigate the depths of an ancient and long gone mountain belt. We want to see the rocks that are below 10 kilometers depth. Do you recall the importance of the 10-kilometer depth? Earthquake foci! So this is where we're looking, deep in the rocks, between that 10 to 30-kilometer depth range, noted by those thick red lines. After the mountain belt has fully formed and starts to erode, many things still happen. Erosion of the surface rocks and uplift of the bottom continental crust will bring our area of interest closer to the surface. But also during this time period, the structures at depth are still active. But now that they're higher up, there's less pressure and temperature, and we will still see them form as mylanites, but also we will see the formation of cataclasites. The same process continues and continues, active structures occurring as cataclasites now, and our earthquake focus are within reach of the surface, if not nearly close to the surface. That makes it easier for us to explore the depths of a mountain belt. This is where we are with shadow. Thank you very much, natural earth processes. You made our lives much easier. Also notice that as the mountain belt erodes, you can form sandstone basins right here beside the mountain belt. This is how the Athabasca Basin formed. All right, back to the Virgin River Shear Zone. We've got mylanites on the property. The Saskatchewan Geological Survey has mapped them out for us. You can see in the figure here, in the picture here, the high strain and deformation in those rocks, and the minerals are all stretched. That's plasticity. That's a myelinite. So we know we have the right deeply formed structural rocks. Perfect. Now we need to find the brittle rocks, the one that would have broken and readily allowed for fluid migration, where these mylanites continued to be fractured and faulted as the Virgin River Shear Zone progressed and continued from plastic to brittle conditions. And we know they exist along the Virgin River Shear Zone. This is the Athabasca Basin area, shadows south of the Central Basin, shown in green. So I'm going to focus on this area here to show you that the brittle rocks do in fact exist on the Virgin River Shear Zone. Zoomed in, you can see the shadow in relation to the basin, approximately 25 to 30 kilometers south of the basin edge. The orange dots within the basin are the Centennial deposit, the northern one, and the Dufferin mineralized zone to the south. Both of those occur along the Virgin River Shear Zone. But what I really want to point out is this. Do you see that huge offset in the basin? This is a clear indication of faulting, but it's not faulting during myelinite formation. No, this is faulting during cataclasite formation. If you remember 2 slides ago, mountain belts erode, faults still continue, basins develop. Well, this basin developed from the erosion of the mountain belt, but it still took tens of millions of years or more after formation to solidify. If the sand was flowing, we wouldn't be able to see this offset. Therefore, the basin had already solidified while this fault continued and continued and continued to move. The mountain belts probably started to erode between 2 to 1.8 billion years ago. The basin formed roughly 1.75 billion years ago. Age of mineralization at Centennial is roughly 1.5 billion years ago and or younger. So, and all of the mineralization is hosted in brittle structures, those cataclasites. So these facts emphasize that the Virgin River Shear Zone has been long-lived from myelinite formation through to cataclasites, which have accommodated uranium mineralization. So I will revisit this idea and the area in the second presentation. Right now, we just have to find these structures. For the following slides, we'll be looking at the resistivity results from the MT survey over shadow. Resistivity and conductivity are basically the same thing, they're just inverses of each other. As per the definitions, resistivity is how strongly a material resists electrical current, making it resistive, whereas conductivity is the amount of electrical current a material can carry, making it conductive. High resistivity equals low conductivity, and high conductivity equals low resistivity. When I show the resistivity lows, which will be colored in pink on the plan maps and red to maroon on the cross sections, I will simply refer to them all as conductors. And by conductors, I'm not specifying graphitic conductors, but I'm specifying the broad spectrum of conductors that I can assume to be the combination of either the right rock types, probably with structures and alteration along them. They are the areas that we want to focus on first for exploration, because this is where we'll find evidence of fluid flow and cataclasites. And given some of the work done by the Saskatchewan Geological Survey, we know that there are graphitic bearing rocks in this area. But that's to be revisited in part 2. So we're finally looking at some geophysical data on shadow. Looks beautiful, doesn't it? I love it. As mentioned, we'll focus on the pink areas as they are. We'll focus on the pink areas as they are what we are looking for. But what we're also looking for are those lozenge shapes too. We can't forget about those. They're very important. From this view, it might be hard for you to see them, so we'll take the time to investigate further. But the first one I hope you can see is here. This feature caught my eye on day one. I think this is by far the best thing we could have asked for on Shadow. Obviously, so far, we still need to drill to find something much better. But this shape is slightly different than what we've looked at. Although it's our lozenge, in this case, we're not looking for the inside of the feature, but rather we're looking along the edges of this feature, because that is where all the magic will happen. This feature still tells us that we're in shear tectonic zone, which is exactly the place we want to be. Seeing this shape simply tells me that the structure in this area is intense. Again, that's what we're looking for. And we couldn't have formed this shape without a strong structural regime. And this is the Virgin River Shear Zone that produced this feature. So the Virgin River Shear Zone is a strong structural regime. So I've simply taken this last image, which was pretty plain, and now showing you the interpreted individual conductor axes. So this provides us with more defined targets to explore. But if you also recall the example that I had of the San Andreas Fault, where I showed that it wasn't just one simple line, but rather a series of fault zones acting together, and then further building on that to show the number of individual faults within the San Fran area, this is the same thing interpreted here. Here are our individual faults. Where do we want to explore along these faults? Well, we want to find those bifurcation points, or those merge points. And here are some of the more prominent areas highlighted with the black circles. There are far more on the property and at depth too. So let's start to examine some of these. We'll start the in-depth interpretation in the north end of the property. I've divided the property into 3 geographic sections: north, central, and south. In this image, the apparent conductivity is on the left-hand side, and the magnetics covering the same area is on the right-hand side. Here's our first lozenge, apparent to me on the conductive side. Hopping over to the magnetics, we see the outline here. But we also see some features of interest in the magnetics, showing that something has happened to the magnetic, that something has happened in this area to the magnetic signal. That's what these red arrows are pointing to. More than likely, they are structures, but we won't know without additional exploration on the ground or with the drill. All we can do right now is just make interpretations. Alternatively, if nothing happened in this area, then we'd expect the magnetic signal to remain uninterrupted, as highlighted by these black arrows. The magnetics are smooth and linear here. Pretty boring in all honesty. So we're looking for these lozenges with evidence supporting that something more has happened in these immediate areas. So if we look further south on the conductivity image, I can see a rather large lozenge. Showing it over on the magnetic side, we can see where this feature overlays. And within there, we can see some breaks, bends, and shifts in the magnetic features, again indicating that something has happened to disturb the normalcy of it all. This is an area where we could possibly have fluid migration. Now we'll start looking at the vertical sections of the conductivity interpretations within this northern area. We'll start here, along the purple lines where the black arrow is pointing. We'll look at 4 consecutive sections from lines 2000 to 2120, where these sections are migrating south towards a bifurcation point. Will we see any lozenges here? Well, we sure do. I can see them, but let's build on this. The red elongate blobs in the cross sections correlate with the overall conductive anomalies seen on the plan maps. Sometimes you can see the individual interpreted conductor axes, such as the case with the 2 arrows close together. Sometimes they are more apparent in another geophysical interpretation. But this close proximity of conductors that we see with 2 arrows is another perfect place to explore for the right structures. I also use the bottom peaks emphasized by the dashed black line to interpret the structures. The deeper penetration of these features, the better. The hotter the color, so the more maroon they are, the better. The deeper and hotter, the more conductive. In this case here, you can see the left side conductor is slightly lower than the right side, but the right side is slightly hotter. You can't really win them all. Moving to the next section, the two conductors on the right side have now become one. They bifurcated or merged. But we also see the bottom part of the feature switch, that now the right side is deeper than the left side. On the next section, as the two broad conductive anomalies approach each other, we can start to see a lozenge form. And when these conductors are basically on top of each other, we get a larger lozenge. Lozenges at bifurcation points. It fits exactly with the examples that I've shown up to this point. Also note now that the bottom peak is much lower and very prominent on the right side versus the left side. Recall my examples of structures where we were looking at flower structures with pivot points, also known as scissor faults, or even the fault ramps. Is that what we're seeing here? I honestly don't know, but I really hope so because these are ideal places for fluids. This is where you get a lot of permeability and porosity. Now compare this section with the first one. The conductors are deeper, they're hotter, and larger. So the geology simply gets better towards these bifurcation points. Pretty cool, eh? Let's look at some more, because there's a lot more to look at. So here we'll look at what happens between lines 2680 and 2800, so 100 meter distance. These sections cover another bifurcation point, but also note that this is the point on the property where we basically start to see a lot of bifurcations and lozenges starting to occur. This is the penultimate bifurcation point. Now let's see what happens here along these section lines. Maybe you can already see what's going on before I point it out. So it looks like there are two possible discrete conductors within the broader left conductor. It's difficult to see anything on the right-hand side, but seeing that intense conductive feature is always interesting. The bottom of the features favors the right over the left side, similar to the end of the sections that we last looked at. Once these broad conductors merge, we see it happen. There's the lozenge shape appears. And now the bottom of the features favor the left over the right side. There's that switch again. Remember the change in foliations as well that I also showed you, specifically at Key Lake, Denison's Gryphon, Next Gen Zero? Well, we might be seeing these same type of subtle features too. And this is very important for us to understand. We're looking for this degree of subtlety. We're looking for these changes. So I have to admit the north part of the property looks pretty darn good. Let's see what's going on in the central part of the property. Because now that we're south of that penultimate bifurcation point, well, there could be a lot more happening. So we'll be covering the Key, Eagle, and Sioux target areas, which are circled with the black ellipses. We are back to looking at both conductivity on the left and mag on the right. Before I get too far involved with some explanations, I want to point out on the magnetic image on the right side, where I've just indicated with the black arrows, that we still see these small scale lozenges within the system of interest and also outside. This is still very highly indicative of the stressed and plastically deformed structural trend we're investigating along the Virgin River Shear Zone. All right, first feature, this is probably one of my favorites. I love it for so many reasons, but unfortunately you're just going to have to wait for part 2 of this series to understand the full picture. I'm just going to tease you with it now. Trust me, it's worth the suspense. If you've learned something from this presentation already, you're going to learn a lot from the next presentation. Here's the same feature covering the magnetic side. It's here, though, where these arrows are pointing that I see those extra breaks, especially the more southern one. It's more than breaks. It's a clear disturbance in the mag. Almost sound like a Jedi saying that, a clear disturbance in the Force. But anyway, the northern red arrow is pretty tight, well defined. With this one to the south, it looks like it breaks apart and diminishes in thickness. Personally, I think this is alteration. I can't guarantee that yet, but just looking at the geophysics, this is definitely an arrow that we want to follow up with a gravity survey. All right, the key lozenge number 2, basically a continuation of the first one. The key target area is pretty well just a series of lozenges, and here it is on the magnetic side. So we see the same type of magnetic disturbance, that something has gnawed away at the magnetic signature. Maybe it's just a geological feature related to the rock types. Obviously, we won't know until drilled, or even the gravity will help. Lozenge number 3. It's not covered by a target area, which goes to show that that shadow has so many target areas going for it. This is a project with longevity. Same feature on the magnetic side. And now these arrows point to the same type of feature as observed over at key. This one could be bifurcation of the lithology. Notice how at the arrows, the mag signature is thick. Lots of possibilities. But the important part is that it's something happening in the mag. It's not just a boring feature. All right, the Eagle Sioux lozenge is a standalone feature. It's huge. There's something very unique and discreet about it though. It really stands out on its own, especially in the mag. It's very discreet, and there's a lot of things going for it as well. First, we'll look at those black arrows. It's pretty boring here, very straight and linear, but that's not to say that that isn't anything. Sometimes that straight and linearity could actually be what you're looking for. It's all about how geologists interpret things. But towards the end of this feature, where the red arrows are, yes, we can see the features in the magnetics that suggest something has happened here. Something definitely worth investigating in more detail. All right, last lozenge I'll point out. It's a small one, but it's there, and on the magnetics. And within the magnetics, there's a subtle break in there. Now that we've got to see some of these, features at depth. What potential exists there? Starting with lines 3720 to 3840. 4 sections over 120 meters. And when you look closely, you can see this is bifurcation country. If these are structures, the voids would have undoubtedly created a vacuum that would have drawn in fluids. So in this case, I've had to draw in vertical white dashed lines to help you differentiate between the two limbs of that shear zone. I've drawn the same differentiator as a dashed blue line on the plan map at the bottom for ease of your visualization. I'll also refer to each of these sections as west, so left of the white or blue line, and east, right of the white or blue line. All right, west side, bottom of the ellipse is deeper on the left versus the right. And we have our two main conductors. We are close to bifurcation points and we can see the lozenge shape. All great, perfect. Now we'll hop over to the fourth picture on the right side of this slide, staying with the west side. Starting with the bottom of the ellipses, we are seeing the bottom of the ellipse shift. That's that possible rotation again. The bottom of the ellipses are now on the right side, possibly indicating favorable structures. You can follow the shift of these ellipse bottoms on your own by looking at the 4 sections. Also note, we are not at a bifurcation point. So why are we seeing the lozenges here? I honestly don't know, but all I can tell you is that I love it. Staying on this image, we can see our 3 conductors clearly now, but there are no lozenges. Okay, time to shift focus to the east side of these sections. Notice the black lines at the bottom of the ellipses. Well, on the east side, the bottom of the ellipses across all of the sections are relatively flat. That doesn't mean no interest or joy, not at all. It very well could mean that there's been less vertical displacement in this area, and that it's simply pure horizontal shear, which is still fantastic. That's still what we're looking for. We're looking for structures. So remember, we're just looking for fluid pathways. That's what we need to find. They won't all look the same, as per that example in the shear zone lexicon of images, with 20 different possibilities for creating porosity and permeability along structures many slides ago. We have to realize that we can see different types of structures here. The ability to recognize and understand these differences will make us successful. So here we go. We're seeing 3 conductors in the area, probably more. And we still have our lozenges, both angled differently from each other. And we see a lot of bifurcation in this area too, indicating the potential for a lot of structures. On the east side of the far section, can't really see a lozenge, more like one giant mass. But we can still see 4 discrete conductors, rather closely spaced. This is where you can get fluid pathways galore. So we're shifting our investigation further south now, looking at the sections across the middle of the key target area and the north end of the Eagle Sioux target. There's lots of things going on here. Shifting our gaze to the right side of the image, here in the key area, the arrow is pointing to an area where we see a conductor stop. We also see a completely different oriented north-south conductor find its way into this area. Will this conductor have an impact on the key target area here? Not sure, but remember the exciting magnetic features in this area, okay, where we had things kind of being gnawed away. Down at the Eagle Sioux, we are concentrating on bifurcation points, here on one trend, but also on this other trend where the same north-south conductor feature from the key is intersected down here. The influence of that conductor could be impacting the conductors in this whole area. So maybe we'll see that in these sections. Same thing here as the previous sections, only now the white and blue dashed lines separating west, left side, central, middle, and east, which is on the right side. So starting with the bottom of the ellipses, here on the west side of the first section, and our individual conductors. And here's the lozenge they form. We're still seeing a continuation of lozenges from the previous set of sections here. That's great. You know, that really indicates Key Lake is a good, strong conductor and structural area to focus on. This arrow here shows the conductor that terminates. And if you look closely where I've just circled in green, it looks like that conductor merges with the lozenge in this area, starting at around 250 to 300 meters below the surface. This is another great area to explore. So we'll stay focused on the west side of things and jump over to the section on the far right. Here's the bottom of the ellipses. Don't really see a change in the conductor bottom here though. Our two conductors as well. There might be some essence of the third one, but it's not really distinguishable. And we're still seeing this lozenge shape. There's lots of potential here. Okay, let's quickly look over at the central zone. First section, highlighted with the blue arrows this time, we can pull out two discrete conductors beside each other. We see that same on the last section. They're still apparent. All right, now we'll hop over to the east side of the sections, back to the first section, where we have three visible conductors. Maybe there's a fourth one in gray, but we don't have any apparent lozenges. And on the last section, we see the same thing. We still have three conductors, maybe four in gray, no apparent lozenges, but we're not really expecting them on this side simply because the structural dynamics are changed. However, the whole shape of the three or four conductors over here create one giant lozenge. So maybe that's something that we're looking for. All right, the last set of sections that we'll look at for the central part of shadow are here. These sections in particular will look at the south end of shadow where the bifurcations basically terminate. We're also looking at additional bifurcation points on the Eagle Sioux trend. All right, let's dive in. Three sections to cover. I won't differentiate it with lines between east and west this time because they are far enough apart. Bottom of the ellipses. They look pretty equal across the board, east and west. Focusing on the west side, the left side of the first section, we see two conductors here in this section. No apparent lozenges. That's the first time for Key Lake area over 850 kilometer strike length. So jumping over to the third section, which is the right side of the slide, maintaining focus on the west side first, we can see a change in the bottom of the ellipse. We still see two conductors, which create our lozenge shape right at a bifurcation point. Now to focus on the east side of the images, on the first section we have our conductors. The two or three that are closer together form a lozenge shape. And we're close to a bifurcation point. So the theory of bifurcation points and lozenges in shadow have been very convincing so far. Lots of favorable drill hole targets in my honest opinion. And on the final section, we still see these three conductors, no readily apparent lozenges, but we wouldn't expect them to be there because of the lack of bifurcation points. All right, guys, we're nearing the end here. We're finishing off the MT interpretations by looking at a couple of cross sections in the southern part of the property, covering the arrow target in particular. Here's our first lozenge, apparent on the conductivity side, and the same shape on the magnetic side. Looking at the magnetics in this area I've just pointed to, you can see that it's pretty tame. There's not much going for it. But if you follow it south, and then you get a change in magnetics noted here. Right at a bend in the magnetics, observed as a change in the magnetic signature. If we look at the other side of the magnetic lineaments within the arrow lozenge itself, right here, which I've just highlighted with an arrow, this is where I see one of the most convincing magnetic changes that require further investigation with a gravity survey. There's a very small bend, a slight flexure in the magnetics here. South of this arrow, the magnetic signature is tame and boring, but north of it, the magnetic signature has changed. It's not as sharp and the gradients are flatter. Is this one of those subtleties in the foliations that we're looking for? What's honestly causing this change? I don't know, but I can guarantee you I want to find out. So let's follow this trend south along to this new red arrow, and we'll also see a similar thing happen. A bend in the magnetics, a change in the magnetic signature. Yeah, I think there's a lot of perspective structures down here. It's all very encouraging. All right, new lozenge. Here it is on the magnetics. To be honest, most of the northerly part of this lozenge is pretty straightforward. Magnetics is rather simplistic. But we do see subtle break in the magnetic signal here. Is that a structure? Don't know. And down here, very similar. But once we start to get down here on the southern part of the lozenge, I start to see some other features happen that lead down to here, where we see the same thing happening on the arrow lozenge, where there is a bend in the magnetics. The gradient clearly changes from sharp, south of the arrow, to washed out and almost flattened at the arrow. This is a great place to follow up with gravity surveying and hopefully diamond drilling as well. All right, for this area in particular, we're just going to look at two individual sections. These sections are spaced 280 meters apart from each other. So there is actually quite a bit that happens in between. I just felt that these two sections are the most representative of the area. In the first section, we'll see what happens at this bifurcation point, and here down towards the apparent horsetail structure. And on the eastern front, we'll see more bifurcation points, especially near the Sioux target area, and following up some additional features of interest here, south of the Eagle-Sioux trend. So we've got the same white and blue lines dividing west and east, but this one I have to do a little bit differently. Here's the main conductor continuing from Key Lake, but if you notice, there's still a conductor to the left of here, this conductor. Unfortunately, it wasn't picked up in the interpretations, but it is very real. So yeah, in all honesty, we have some slight fixes that are required on my end, only human after all. And looking at the bottom of the ellipses, this one that was missed seems to be more prevalent. On the right-hand section, we see 3 conductors now, as properly interpreted. But looking at the bottom of the ellipses, they've changed so that the eastern one is deeper, indicating that possible rotation or pivot, or even interpreted as a relay ramp structure, or even just the changes in the foliation. All right, on to the eastern side of sections. 2 conductors readily apparent here. Bottom of the ellipses are pretty even. Similar to the other section, but now we have 4 discrete conductors. To go from 2 to 4, they have to bifurcate. All right, folks, here we are. Last set of sections. Right down here, covering that awesome magnetic inflection I love, but also looking at a horsetail splay and a multitude of conductors on the east side. All right, one section, let's have a quick look. Welcome to Conductoropolis. What a fantastic sight to behold. Now, if we're looking for structures, these conductors will help us get there. The conductor that I'm really excited about associated with the magnetic features highlighted here in the green ellipse. Assuming conductors are faults, that's gorgeous. Look at the depth of penetration and the hot colors associated with it. It's conductive. And if you do look close enough, there's a very subtle lozenge shape to it. I just simply haven't highlighted it. But we still have other lozenges here. One in the horsetail splay of the arrow target, the other on the eastern side. There's so much potential and a lot of exploration will be required. But I can't end it there. This is one of the most northern sections of the survey, line 1200. Do you see the differences from a couple of isolated conductors in the north to an onslaught of them in the south? We've basically bifurcated the entire length of the property from 1 or 2, maybe 3 conductors in the north to 8 or more conductors in the south. This would have been earthquake country. This is where we're going to get structures and move some fluids. This is where we're going to see cataclasites following up on pre-existing mylanites. It's the kind of terrain that I think will be successful and make the next Athabasca discovery, or 2, or 3, or even more. At least my fingers are crossed that's going to be the case. And of course, let's not forget about these wonderful shapes we're chasing, ye old lozenge, forever in my dreams. All right, guys, that's it. That's all there is to it. Thank you very much all for watching. Seriously, it really means a lot to me that you sat through this presentation. I do hope that you've learned a lot. I hope you can see why we're excited at Baselode, and I hope you can now envision that dream too. I think I've highlighted a lot of potential targets that definitely require further exploration, something that you guys can really appreciate. I can't guarantee any discoveries, only that we are taking all of the necessary and right steps to make a discovery. So when you hear me talk about why I think shadow is so awesome, now you know, you've seen it for yourself. You know as much as I do, almost. So please, by all means, pass this video along to your colleagues, your friends, family, and fellow investors. Spread the word about Baselode. Together, we can hopefully turn some of these targets from images on a computer screen to near-surface, basement-hosted, high-grade uranium deposits. Obviously, if the uranium is there. But if it's there, we'll find it. Stay tuned for part 2 of this video in the coming weeks, where I'll focus on the fluids themselves and highlight why I believe we've had the right uraniferous fluids on the property. We'll look at the right rock types in the area. We'll also look at potential alteration zones, all of which play a very important part in the grand scheme of deposit formation. And I'll even share some additional insights for the key area. It's mind-blowing. So this has definitely been my pleasure to present Shadow for you. Thank you again. Stay safe, stay healthy.